From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Another big political trial begins, this time for Hunter Biden, as the first son faces charges that he bought and possessed a Colt revolver while addicted to illegal drugs. But is this a case of selective prosecution, and is a pardon waiting from President Dad? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnist Bill McGurn and editorial board member Monet Ukwe-Barua. This week's political legal drama is in the federal courthouse in Wilmington, Delaware, where the two sides on Tuesday are giving their opening arguments in what is set to be the first of two trials of Hunter Biden. Bill, I wonder if you can lay the groundwork for us, give us the context. What is Hunter Biden charged with, and what do you make of the cases that each side is making so far?
Well, this is just a gun trial. The tax trial, I think, is in August in California. This is in Delaware. And there's three counts. They're basically very simple, all stemming from the same act. In 2018, he bought a .38 from a gun dealer. He lied on the federal form and lied to the gun dealer by saying he wasn't an addict or a user. And then he's also charged with one count of possessing the gun, which he had for 11 days. Presumably he'd have had it for longer, except that his then girlfriend, Hallie Biden, threw it in a grocery store dumpster at the time. So originally what happened is special counsel David Weiss reached a plea deal on the tax and gun charges that would grant broad immunity and a chance to get this expunged from his record. And under basic questions from the judge, it was a real Rube Goldberg operation. The setup required her saying some things. It collapsed. He couldn't defend it in court. And my conclusion is that he filed subsequent charges because Hunter wouldn't agree to another plea deal, maybe because it included jail time. And I think it was about salvaging his own reputation as much as administering justice.
One thing that is fascinating about this case is that, to my eye, Monet, the basics of the facts and the charges here seem pretty clear. The firearms form that Bill is referring to here is ATF Form 4473. And here's the question: are you an unlawful user of or addicted to marijuana or any depressant, stimulant, narcotic drug, or any other controlled substance? The checkbox then is yes or no. And this is the form, the firearms transaction record, it is called, that you fill out when you are purchasing a gun. And if you answer yes, that you are an addict of an illegal drug, a narcotic, or so forth, that purchase is not supposed to go through. And part of what the prosecution is doing today in its arguments is playing excerpts of Hunter Biden's memoir called Beautiful Things, the audiobook, which he apparently recorded, so it is in his own voice, describing to the court during this time period all of the illegal drugs that he was taking.
Exactly. You have Hunter in his own voice in that memoir sharing his experiences struggling with illegal drugs, sometimes not struggling, in all the lurid detail you can read in that book. He describes it as being a deep, deep addiction, to the point that however you want to define that term, he certainly cleared the bar for it when he purchased that gun and when he filled out that form. There also is testimony today by Erica Jensen, who's an FBI special agent who investigated Hunter Biden, and she was mentioning that, speaking to witnesses, they corroborated the information that was revealed in his memoir. And coming up next, of course, as I'm sure we'll discuss at greater length, we have the famous Hunter Biden laptop, which prosecution is going to introduce into evidence, which also contains messages that Hunter sent during that time that seemed to confess and indicate his drug addiction in exactly the period that he attested that he wasn't an addict on that form. So the legal case seems extremely strong. We're only on the first day, and already there's evidence that seems like it would be very clear and very compelling to any jury who's trying to figure out whether Hunter is guilty as charged.
Bill, what is the defense saying? I gather from some of the bloggers that are at the court doing little updates from inside that one argument they're making is that Hunter Biden, at the moment that he filled out that form, he believed it to be true that he was not an addict when he filled out this federal form.
Well, I'll say two things, one general and one specific. The general point is it's really a lot of chutzpah. For years, he's been arguing all these horrible things I did, fathered a baby out of wedlock, then married another woman, my drug use, my embarrassment to my father and my family, cheating on my wives. All that is because I was a drug addict and I was not thinking clearly over this. And now it turns out, footnote, except for the day I bought the gun. I think that's just a hard sell. They played a voice message from Joe Biden 3 days before Hunter bought the gun saying, get some help. Doesn't sound like a guy who was over his addiction. So I think that's going to be a hard sell. There's all this evidence from the memoirs and stuff. I think it's really going to be a hard thing to persuade the jury that he wasn't. It's a variation on Bill Clinton's, depending on what you mean by the word is. But I think they're going to have a tough sell. It raises a question. With the evidence that's coming out and the witnesses, Monet mentioned Biden in his own voice reading his memoirs. It's very damning. The number one witness against him seems to be himself. So you got his memoirs. You're going to have his ex-wife. You're going to have his ex-girlfriend, who was his brother's wife, Hallie Biden. And there's all sorts of embarrassing things that can tumble out. I don't know why Hunter and his team didn't settle. Maybe it was because they couldn't get a deal without jail time. But he has in his back pocket a presidential pardon from his father. His father is not going to let him go to jail. So I think he could have reached that and spared his dad all this embarrassment.
Here's what Hunter Biden's defense attorney, Abby Lowell, is saying in the courtroom, according to the Washington Post live blog. He never used it, referring to the gun, and then it was thrown out in the trash 11 days later. Also saying that Hunter Biden had a busy schedule, and so that proves that he was not a true addict. The quote is, there may be high-functioning alcoholics, but there's no such thing as a high-functioning crackhead. Unquote. Again, that is Abby Lowell, the defense attorney for Hunter Biden. But Monet, I agree with Bill that I find it hard to believe that the jury is going to be persuaded by that argument. On the other hand, perhaps some of the jurors have struggled with addiction in their own families or their own lives. And there is a question about sort of jury nullification. The directives to the jury generally is that if you find beyond reasonable doubt that the defendant did the activity and that the law covers that activity, you are required to return a guilty verdict. But once you're sitting in the jury box, you could, for any reason, say, I don't think that this is an appropriate prosecution. And so I, as the juror, am going to vote no.
Yes, I do think that because of all the reasons Bill has laid out, the compellingness of the evidence, really the only strategy that Hunter Biden's defense can pursue is trying to make him seem as sympathetic as possible and suggest that the charges shouldn't have been brought in the first place. I do think that bringing some of his sympathetic family members into the courtroom and describing his earnest struggles to improve over the course of his life are likely to resonate with some of the jurors in America today. It's very common for people to be not more than 1 or 2 steps removed from that in their own lives. But I do think that the problem with regard to this specific case is that his addiction is exactly what he attested not to have, and that is the basis of the crime. It kind of would be akin to someone using the insanity defense in a case where they were being prosecuted for claiming that they weren't insane. He just can't get away from it. You know, he has attested something that was very, very clearly not true. And I think that any prosecution worth their salt will be able to point out, despite the fact that he might be sympathetic in some ways, he very clearly violated the letter of the law, which will not be difficult for jurors to understand. So I think that it's unlikely that they'll decide not to convict in the end just because of how clear all the evidence is and how simple the crime that he's being charged with is.
Hang tight. We'll be right back in a moment. Welcome back. Let's move to some of the secondary arguments then. And one of them, Bill, is that these cases are not often brought, not often prosecuted. And so the defense, Hunter Biden, may make the argument in court, or this may be part of the case to the broader public that this is a sort of a selective prosecution. And I wonder what you make of that argument.
Well, I'm not a lawyer, so I asked Andy McCarthy, a former federal prosecutor who's been following this case, and he says that's not true. It's true when the person filling out the form and lying on the form, who may be a drug addict, didn't get the handgun. It didn't go through. They're not going to prosecute. But he said in this case, He got the gun. He was reckless with it, as pictures show. And eventually it ended up in a dumpster for which he's culpable. He didn't secure it well enough. And he said they prosecute these cases all the time. Moreover, he points out that under the gun, quote, reform passed by Democrats under Joe Biden, the penalty for lying on the form on that part was increased from 10 to 15 years, indicating that they want prosecutors to prosecute it. So it's hard to argue, no special treatment for Hunter when you have this record of Joe Biden being firmly on the other side on the issue.
One piece of analysis I've seen on this question is an article in the Washington Post in 2022 that uses some data from the U.S. Attorney's case management system. It says that there were 27 million firearm background checks in 2019 and only 478 referrals for lying on this Form 4473. And prosecutors then filed only 298 cases. So that does suggest that these prosecutions are not unprecedented, but not common. But a couple of things I would say in response to that. One is that it's difficult to tease out the details of all of these cases because this is a long form with many questions on it, and it's hard to know which answers people were prosecuted for and what the specific circumstances were. And as Bill explains, this firearm that Hunter Biden purchased was not recovered in a secure location in Hunter Biden's house. It was thrown by his then girlfriend into a garbage can outside of a grocery store across the street from a high school. So that is the kind of extenuating circumstance that might make prosecutors, even if this were a no-name defendant, more interested in that case, given the location that the gun ended up with unsecured. And two, I think there's also precedent in the Justice Department for using high-profile cases to try to set examples and send a message to the public that this sort of thing is not tolerated. And I feel like every time there is a significant shooting in this country, there is an argument about whether America's gun laws need to be tightened or whether they need to be enforced. And this is a prime example of what people arguing the latter say is a law that ought to be enforced. If there are people who are lying on these firearms forms, some of those transactions don't go through, but some of them do go through. And those people ought to be prosecuted for breaking the law.
That's right. That's definitely a consensus in an American public that's sharply divided over what the restrictions and allowances should be on gun ownership. I think you would find very large majorities saying that drug addicts shouldn't be allowed to purchase them in the same way that there are restrictions on people with criminal histories purchasing them, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is a clear example of a law that I think a lot of people would support. Whether or not it's been enforced vigorously is beside the point. Now that these charges have been brought, it makes quite a lot of sense to say Hunter Biden should be accountable, not just for violating the letter of the law, but because there's an important principle there that's worth defending and saying people need to be responsible with themselves before they're able to own and use firearms. I also do think that Hunter Biden is clearly not the example anyone would present of a responsible legal gun owner. There's no indication that the defense has suggested he bought this gun for self-defense or even for legitimate recreation because he wanted to go to the range and fire off shots. Instead, what we see is pictures of himself posing with it. It really seems as if he bought this gun as part of an indulgence in a kind of irresponsible lifestyle that also involved drug use and drinking and carousing and all manner of other things. And there's a reason why his girlfriend at the time decided to take it away from him without his notice and toss it away because she didn't trust him to use it responsibly, maybe worried that he'd even be a danger to himself given the struggles that he was going through. And so it definitely makes sense to say that Hunter Biden is not just guilty of some kind of technicality in lying on the form, but that he's the kind of irresponsible gun owner who this law was designed to prosecute.